All right, welcome back. So we had all those sort of thoughts about all the sort of bad things that were happening in the world and all the sort of proposed solutions to them. Now we're going to look into what realist artists did with all of that. So one thing we can definitely talk about is literature. Literature goes in some fascinating new directions during this time period. And by literature, again, I just mean, any kind of writing. But in this video, we're mostly going to be talking about fiction. There's a new movement towards fiction that really shows, all these dark sides of the world, all the dark sides of the Industrial Revolution and the things that are going on in the world. It's being depicted to show sort of the evil of it. And that's sort of a commonality with all these different writers. You've got folks like Charles Dickens and Mark Twain. All of them have this interest in sort of showing the world as it is, not as the Romantics would do it, with like this sort of ideal, like heroic, marvelous way of thinking about things. Everything is sort of beautiful or passionate. Well, we're moving away from that a bit. We're moving more towards, well, here's how it is. Here's how people, as they are actually acting, here's things how they actually are, as far as we can determine it. Trying to make things clear. And part of this goal is to shock people's conscience and to wake them up to what's really going on. For instance, we take a look at the work of Charles Dickens. Oliver Twist is famous for the story being the story of this orphan on the streets of London. He's just trying to get by. He joins child gangs. He joins there's a leader, an adult leader who kind of exploits him, and he's often very close to starving. This is, just showing things that were actually going on, and maybe people didn't want to face it. But you know what? When Charles Dickens started publishing his stuff in newspapers, it caught fire. People really were fascinated to read about all this, and they couldn't wait for more. So he was really showing them a lot of what was going on that they hadn't been seeing before. He also wrote about debtors' prisons. This was the thing, is if you were in debt, you could be thrown into prison for it. And this was something that had happened to his own father. And he exposed that and how exploitative a system that was. Another really fascinating work along this line is in Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn. And well, Mark Twain had written realistically for a while. He wrote some autobiographical stuff about his life, sort of just working on various ships going down the rivers in America. He had also, just sort of taken an interest in ordinary people's lives. So he was the perfect guy for something like this. And in Huckleberry Finn, which you may have read in school, a lot of people do, he takes this character from what was kind of his boy's adventure novel, Tom Sawyer, and uses this character to make the ultimate statement about the injustice of slavery. Basically, he has Huckleberry Finn, who has this friend of his who is, a slave who he is helping the slave to escape, but he's been told that people who help slaves escape will go to hell. And so he's, traveling down the river with his friend, and eventually he realizes that he doesn't care if he's going to hell. He literally says, "I'll go to hell," which is a big break from the ideology of this time. I'm not going to send this guy back into slavery, which is, pretty cool. So this is a big statement, and it's controversial today because it uses a lot of the archaic language that was and some of the actual racism that was present at the time. But I would say showing the racism actually, it helps to inoculate us against it, because Twain is ultimately saying that it is wrong. Now, for a different approach, not so much focused on particular issues like slavery, but just sort of the lives of people in general, we have a lot of Russian authors. One of them is Dostoevsky, who kind of has these sort of serious protagonists who are trying to figure out the nature of good and evil, the nature of God, how they feel about the way that life is going. We have Tolstoy, who writes these big sort of family epics like War and Peace and Anna Karenina, which involve ordinary people's lives very often as they're caught in the middle of unimaginable suffering. Horrible wars, horrible things happen, and the characters have to deal with it. That's a big shift from sort of optimistic heroic literature, and it's really focused on the individual lives here, not on some ideal. And it's kind of showing the problems that they're going through again. We also have Flaubert, who wrote Madame Bovary, which is a sort of a story, a pretty frank story of a woman who has a series of sort of sexual adventures that leave her unsatisfied. That's a pretty radical theme to be introducing in a time period where people don't want to think about women having sex. This is a pretty shocking thing to write about. Similarly, there's Kate Chopin, who wrote a book called The Awakening. You might have heard of that one. And basically, this book is all about a woman realizing that she's not happy being married to the man that she is married to. And that might not seem like that big a deal for us, but the idea of being able to leave a marriage or to be tired of the life that you have as a woman, that's a really big thing to acknowledge. In the same way, it's a big thing to acknowledge that, you know, the subordination of women to men is bad. Here's women realizing that in literature. And so that's why The Awakening is still a big deal. We also have the work of Zola. Zola writes a lot about being a coal miner and how sort of intense and horrific that experience could be. So all these authors are kind of trying to shine a light on the injustices of the world and show things to people so that it gets their consciousness to wake up. And if the popularity of Charles Dickens and Mark Twain is any indication, it really did work to some degree. It sort of showed people things they hadn't seen before. Okay, so then we get to the visual arts. So in terms of realism in the visual arts, it's not going to be quite as much about making a statement, but it is going to be about showing people's lives as they honestly are. Whereas the Romantics, even though they were interested in themes of justice, they tended to present more of an ideal or something to strive for. The Realists are not going to present an ideal. They're going to present an, they're going to try and almost take a picture as much as they can, take a photograph through painting and other visual arts. Now, photographs can be deceptive, and so can realist art. Even though they wanted to be realists, that doesn't mean they were 100% realistic, but that was the goal that they set for themselves. One of these is Courbet. This is probably a self-portrait, but here's how he depicts himself. He's just depicting himself. He's not particularly trying to do anything particularly special. He's just a man smoking a pipe. Here he is. He's just being kind of ordinary, and he's just trying to be like, look, here I am. This is who I am. But he also depicts other people, and sometimes he does that very memorably. One of these is Burial at Ornans. So look at what's going on in this picture. This is, a burial. We've got a Catholic priest. We've got them saying the blessings for the dead. But look at the way that people are behaving in this painting. And first off, the painting style, it doesn't use some of the brighter colors that they would have used during the Romantic period in painting. This is a different style. It's more muted, more subtle, more kind of grounded and gritty, almost like a gritty movie in a way. And look at what the people are doing. They're not presenting some image of like, oh, we are perfect symbols of grief. We are, grieving in the way that you would expect. Instead, they're behaving like real people. Like this kid is looking up at one of the priests. This kid is just kind of looking off to the side. There's a dog there. It's kind of hanging out. This guy's, I think, maybe talking or something like that. Some of the women are looking at the graves, but others of them are looking at each other. And so, and the priest kind of looks kind of a little stuffed, a little self-serious and full of himself, maybe. So this is how people might actually behave as a funeral, not as how people would want people to behave at a funeral. So that's what we see here is a rejection of, the ideal for trying to depict things as they actually are. Now that said, it's still stylized somewhat. This isn't an actual photograph. It has more sort of symbolic stuff with animals and the priests being placed in places of special importance. But that's the idea here. Another realist artist is Millet. Millet does a lot of really interesting realist art because his isn't so much, to expose an issue, and he is more colorful than Courbet. But he just is going to make some paintings of people. And these are ordinary people. These are lower class people. Here's a woman baking bread, and it's very well done. You see all the parts of the process. You see her tools and who she is as a person. You get a good sense of that. Another one of Millet is the harvesters resting. They are, these are the people who are gathering the grain, bringing it in. some of the few sort of farm workers that are still around during this time period. And they're just doing like they would ordinarily do. They're taking a break in the middle of their work. They're not like being like these perfect farmers who represent the ideal life that is farming. No, they're just doing what they do. He also has, here's another good one, the potato planters. I love his use of color, honestly. I like the way he has little bits of like blue and red on the clothing here. And the potato planters, they're planting potatoes. This is going to be the food that gets them through the winter, as it was for a lot of people, potatoes. So there you go. That's a way to do realism and just say, hey, this is what ordinary people are like. And I think that that is something you can make a painting about. Another approach is to do sort of, political art, political cartoons, you might say. This is the work of Daumier. Daumier, here is his little sort of symbolic cartoon of freedom of the press. So here is a member of the press, and here are all these sort of kings and generals, and here are sort of ordinary people, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. They play their specific roles in society. And so what he's saying with this cartoon is, and this really feels like a political cartoon you could see today. The press stands as this sort of heroic defense, sort of beats up the unjust kings and leads to the ideas of the people. And I don't know if he's saying that the kings are protected from the common people by the press, or if he's saying that the common people are protected from the kings by the press, or maybe both. But this is idealizing freedom of the press as we would think of it today. Now, for someone who's a bit more controversial in his realism, let's look at Manet. So look at this one. There's a lot to observe here. First off, we can notice some focus here that there is, a white woman and a black woman being depicted here, but the focus is on the white woman and the black woman is kind of made to recede into the background. This is something we haven't really talked about a lot, but a lot of paintings actually have black servants or black slaves in them, including some very famous people like George Washington. And there's a tendency to just sort of crop the slaves out of the image, just because it's uncomfortable, and we don't want to think about that was being promoted in that image. I'm not sure what Monet's purpose is actually here, with including, I think, the female servant here, if he's trying to send a message with that or not, or if that's just sort of something that's being taken for granted. The controversy is not focused on that. The controversy has been focused on the woman here. So first off, she's very much more ordinary than some of the naked women we've seen so far. And that's art for you. You have to talk about depictions of naked women, the history of art. But she is more ordinary. She's not Venus. She's not this perfect sexual archetype. She's just sort of typical. She looks beautiful, but also she kind of looks maybe bored. She looks a little out of it. Her body maybe isn't 100% perfect. But, she is being depicted as a naked object of sexual desire. She is being depicted as beautiful, but also ordinary in a certain way. And then it gets more controversial from there, is that the ribbon that she's wearing is one that's usually associated with sex workers, courtesans, or prostitutes. So instead of, you wouldn't think this would be controversial, right? Because we already had paintings with naked women in them. But when Manet makes it a very ordinary naked woman, and on top of that, a prostitute, he is really pushing the envelope. This is not what people are ready to hear or to see. It makes people very angry that he painted this painting, because he's presenting more sexual women and women who are not supposed to be worthy of respect. Then he's depicting them more than they were ever depicted before. And maybe that plays into his decision to include the servant. I don't know. It might also be a blind spot, where he can see, the dignity of this woman, but he can't see the dignity of this woman. I don't know. I actually haven't researched Monet's thought process there. But I do know a lot of people, even among the realists, had their blind spots. Here's some more Monet. This is a very interesting one. You can see how art is developing here. It's moving away from kind of the way that shapes were being depicted in like Baroque art and Romantic art. And eventually we're going to get to something called Impressionism. But for now we have this. And he's just got a whole crowd of pretty ordinary people who have gathered to come to listen to music. And so again, it's that emphasis on the ordinary. Okay, so that's realistic art and literature. Next, we're going to talk about some architecture and a few more sort of core ideas. But this is enough for this video. So I'll cut it off here and I'll see you in the next one for architecture and music.